So, Tanya chapter 8, and we're continuing really the theme of last week. What was the theme of last week? The theme of last week was that how, going back really a little earlier, we have this basically two types of impurity. You have the impurity, which is called the three unholy klipot. Unholy means that it's completely, the spark of God that's within that object is completely concealed and completely inaccessible. And then we said there's the second category would be the klipa, which is the peel or the shell that is light, which means some light is allowed in. And what are the ramifications of that? So here we say as follows: if I engage in this klipa, not for the sake of heaven, not for a spiritual purpose, then that klipa remains in the realm of unholiness. Because again, what is unholy? Unholy, we defined earlier in chapter 6 as holiness is transparent to God, where you can see and sense the divine purpose. If you cannot see or sense the divine purpose, then it's categorized as unholy. So if I engage in something that is kosher, in other words, there's nothing wrong with this behavior, but it's not godly. So therefore it remains in the realm of the unholiness. However, this is where the human being comes into play. When the human being engages in the matters of the world that are permissible, and if he does so there's two categories, because it's a little complicated. It's a little detailed. If I do so for the sake of heaven, I elevate it immediately. I'm eating breakfast so that I can have with the awareness of the service of God. I'm eating breakfast so I can have the energy to go and make the world a better place. I'm eating breakfast with the intention, with the awareness that I'm doing so to go do a mitzvah, to study Torah. In that case, the experience itself becomes holy. There's another way, which is I just ate it without any awareness. It's not elevated yet, but when I then take that energy to do something good, then the energy is elevated. That's what we discussed. That's what we discussed last week. And it's really almost like gives us a person a lot of responsibility, because really there's so much in the world of what happens in the world, and what the ramifications of every action I do is not just for myself, but it's for the energy of the world. Everything I do has an impact on the world around me and on my advancing my divine mission. So that was a little bit about last week, chapter 7. And chapter 8, we sort of highlight and explain and elaborate a little bit about this, and we add another dimension, which is thinking about. Last week we spoke about food, and we also spoke a little bit about intimate relations, about sexual relations, prohibited ones. Now we're going to sort of we're going to expand the conversation also to the pursuits of the mind, wisdom, gaining wisdom. Is there a kosher way to gain wisdom or non-kosher way to gain wisdom? So we're going to think about that as well. But before that, we want to talk about this. We want to get more detailed about this notion of what happens when I engage with what they call the klipat noga, the klipa of light, but not for the sake of heaven. We also want to talk about what happens if I engage in something that is prohibited. Let's start from there. Let's start from where the Tanya starts. So what are we saying? Coming from chapter 7 is very empowering. It's up to you. Your awareness affects the result of the object in the world that you're interacting with. And that is true for almost everything, but it's not true when it comes, specifically not true when it comes to food. And food is an interesting phenomenon, and not just spiritually, but also physically. A lot of people struggle with food. It's an ongoing battle to eat food in a proper way, in a holy way, even in a wholesome way. Okay, so food is a big deal in the physical sense. It's also a big deal in the spiritual sense. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, most objects in the world that are either positive or negative, it's really about the person. In other words, there's no concept, there's no object called theft, right? It's theft I create the theft. When I do something wrong, I create the prohibited phenomenon, right? There's no object called murder, right? It's created by the human being. When it comes to food or unkosher food, Here we say that there's an object itself that is unkosher. In other words, there's an object itself that receives its energy from unholiness, if it's not kosher, if it's locked in, if I can't release the sparks. And that's what we're going to say here is, even if a person eats food that is not kosher, and he has the proper intention, but I still cannot I can't release the sparks of holiness within there because there's an object that gets its energy from the unholiness. That's one big point. Another point we want to talk about is when a person will engage in food that is kosher, but as we said, that I don't do so with the awareness that it's for the sake of heaven. Just eating breakfast because I'm eating breakfast. Later, I'll take that energy and do something good. So later, the energy is going to be elevated. So here, there's a very interesting thing. Here, because for a while it was not considered holiness, there is an effect on the body. There is an effect on the person. Because what you eat, you become what you eat. And if you look at the Kabbalistic sources, the Kabbalistic sources explain that when a person passes on, there is a process of cleansing that the body and the soul have to go through. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but the idea is that there's a process of cleansing that sometimes is painful. And the Kabbalistic works give different descriptions. That they talk about a concept that they'll call a banging in the grave. There's Gehenna, there's the hell of fire and hell of snow. The idea here is that for the soul to be purified, it has to separate itself from the negative pleasures it had in this world. Now, I'm not an expert on this, and the Tanya doesn't get too deep into this, but the Tanya does say that when a person engages in worldly matters, not for the sake of heaven, it makes a little mark on the person. And even if later he takes that energy to elevate himself, he takes that energy to do something good, which we said last week in chapter 7, that the energy then is elevated, but still, because it was temporarily unholy, it makes a mark on the person. And everything that Kabbalah says that a person needs purification, what is it? It's purification for the things that I ate or that I engaged in that were kosher, but not for a holy purpose, because at that point, it's not holy. It only became holy later when I took that energy to do something good. So in other words, we're trying to say is that we spoke about the limitation of awareness, but here's also the power of awareness. If I engage in the physical world with the proper awareness, then there is no negative mark whatsoever. I'm going to say one more point, which is the third point, and then please tell me what I didn't explain properly, because it's a lot going on here, and then we'll read it inside. The third point he talks about is very interesting. It's not just food, it's not just intimate relations, which we talked about last week, but it's everything. Everything in the world could be done for a holy purpose and not holy purpose, including knowledge, including gaining education, gaining wisdom. Gaining wisdom too. Is it holy? Is it unholy? I'm not talking about wisdom to do something bad of how to rob a bank, but mathematics or sciences or physics. Is it good or is it not good? Is it holy or is it unholy? So you say, what could be wrong with education? What could be wrong with knowledge? But as I'll talk about in a minute, and from the lens of the Tanya, it's not a question of good or bad. There's no bad. The battle that we engage in is not between good and bad. It's between human and godly. And that's the question. Am I human or am I godly? And if I'm human, not so bad to be a human, right? At least I'm not a wild beast. But if I'm human, I'm not godly, because human means I'm concealing the godliness within myself. So same thing, if I engage in inquiring knowledge without a godly purpose, it remains human. It's unholy. Not only is it unholy, but the Tanya here says something more powerful. It's actually more destructive to you than other forms of pleasure. Why? Because the highest form of the human being, the highest faculty, the greatest quality of the human being is the human being's intellect. So if any part of myself has to become holy, certainly my mind has to become holy. And if I don't, if I have a negative effect, if other parts of my psyche are not holy, so it's damaging. But if my mind is unholy, then the damage is much greater. Does this mean you shouldn't engage in acquiring wisdom? Of course not. What it means is it's not a means for an end. It's not a means for itself. It's a means to an end to serve God. What does it mean to serve God with your knowledge? So a few things. First of all, maybe you need an education to earn a living. Oh, why are you earning a living? To serve God. So that's one way where an education, knowledge will be a way of serving God. The awareness of knowledge. While I'm acquiring knowledge, I'm doing this so that I can earn a living and serve God. That's one form, but it's more indirect. There's a more direct way is I'm studying the sciences, I'm studying the knowledge to understand the greatness of God's creation, right? That's more direct. Maimonides talks about this. Maimonides says that the way you know God is by studying God's creation. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman concludes, and that says that's why some of the greatest sages, he mentions Rambam, Ramban, Maimonides, Nachmanides, these people spent a lot of time engaging in the understanding and study of sciences because they used it to serve Hashem. So we're basically expanding the conversation that that this battle between the godly and the human isn't really in every area of life. And by the way, when we conclude this, we conclude the first 8 chapters of the Tanya, which is sort of a unit. The eight chapters of Tanya's first 8 chapters give us sort of an X-ray into what's going on in our soul, the 2 motivations, the godly and the human, and we got an analysis. Chapter 9, 10, and 11, and some of 12 discuss the battle between, the tension between. Right? If you noticed here, we spoke about a few, and we spoke about the godly soul in chapter 3, 4, and 5, and we spoke about the natural soul in chapters 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 9 is what happens when they crash. So we finished a full I'm not gonna say a full section, but we finished a unit, the first 8 chapters. So we're going to read the chapter inside, hopefully. Just to make a point here, again, I want to reiterate. The conventional interpretation is that this essential battle between the human being, within the human being, is a battle between good and evil. There is a bad part of us and a good part of us, and we have a negative part, and a negative part is evil, and we battle with it, and sometimes the good part wins, and sometimes the evil wins. But that's superficial. That would mean that we are creations battling evil, trying to stay away from evil. When Rabbi Shneur Zalman reframes the battle, it's not a question of good and evil. That's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to become good as opposed to becoming evil. And if I don't become good, I'm evil. What we're saying is, with the struggle is, do I want to be self-oriented? Do I want to be creation? Or do I want to be godly? These are the 2 essential drives within the human being, and conflicting drives. Because God, if I want to be godly, means I want to be transcendent. I want to go beyond the self. Everything is for a higher purpose. If I want to be human, if I want to be natural, everything has to tie back to self. And if it's not about myself, I'm not interested in doing it. And that's the essential battle. And that's why it's natural. We're not evil. It's not evil. It's not evil in the conventional sense. I mean, it's evil in the sense that, in some sense, we're classifying anything that is not transparent to God as the other side, as negativity. But the negativity doesn't mean I'm a terrible person. The negativity just means I'm a person. I'm human, right? Nothing wrong with being human. Nothing godly about it either. I mean, except that human, you have the potential to become godly. And that is the drive, and that is the struggle, the essential struggle between the human being. Do I want to remain human? That's what my natural soul wants me to do, because the natural soul is self-oriented. Or do I want to escape the human state and allow for the part of myself that wants to be godly, that wants to be transcendent, to overtake me? Now, it doesn't mean I don't engage in human behavior. I'm eating the same food. I am studying the same wisdom, but it's godly. Why is it godly? Because it's transparent. Why is it transparent? Because you see the connection to God. Why? Because in my mind, the awareness is that I'm doing this for the sake of God. And what the Kabbalah, that's why it's mysticism. Mysticism says what you have in your mind affects the nature of what is happening in the world, affects the nature of this food, what is happening to the food. It all depends if there is awareness to God, and the awareness is brought about by the human perspective. So this is the story in short, chapter 8. We're going to read it inside, God willing. And like I said, we concluded looking at the various parts of the human being. We looked about the 2 souls. What is a soul? 10 sphirot, in other words, the mind and the heart. Every soul has expressions, thought, speech, and action. So every soul has the core motivation, what it really wants. Every soul has the natural, it's self-orientation. For the godly, it's to connect to God, to be transcendent. That's the core of the soul. Every soul has the 10 sefirot, which is the mind, what it understands, how it perceives, and the heart, how it feels, and also how it expresses itself in thought, speech, and action. That really covers, essentially, that covers sort of the skeleton of both souls. And now, those souls are going to clash. And the clash happens in chapter 9. And then going back to the first page of Tanya, if you remember, what is a tzaddik? There's different grades. There's a tzaddik that is good for him, a tzaddik that is bad for him, a wicked person that is good for him, a wicked person that is bad for him. And then there's the intermediary, which we said the whole book is called the Sefer Shel Beinoni, the book of the intermediary person. These are all conditions of what's happening in the clash, sort of marking the battlefield, what happens in the clash between the two souls. But these are the two souls. So in some sense, the 8th chapter gives us the full outline of the, I guess, MRI or whatever technology they use today to see what is the internal workings within each soul, and how each of us has two souls, which are essentially not just different, but in some sense conflicting, because their orientation is completely different. So that's the story in short. If anybody wants to comment or question or object or add, please do. Otherwise, we're going to read it inside. Okay, I guess I didn't say anything provocative. I thought I'm going to try to say something provocative, but I guess everything makes sense. So that's wonderful. Okay, again, we're going to go back to the lessons in Tanya. When you read it, I skip the shaded areas. I skip some of the non-bold letters if it gets too long, because the bold is the actual translation, and then they weave in some commentary. But we'll give it a shot. So again, chapter 8, we start with the discussion of the unholy foods. Even if I eat food that is unholy, even if I eat it with the proper awareness, it still does not elevate it, because the object itself is in a state of unholiness. It's an unholy object by itself. Like we said, that's unique about food. Almost everything else doesn't work that way. Let's say an unholy sexual relationship. The other person, just because the union is not allowed, the other person is allowed. The other person is holy or neutral, right? It's the connection that makes it unholy. Food, we're saying there's an object here that is considered unholy, which means its sparks are tied, as we mentioned last week, and it's hard to unleash it. Now you can unleash it. Remember last week we said, if there's a process in which not just tshuva, but intense tshuva, where what was negative turns to a mitzvah. That's another story, but that was for last week. I didn't say the story last week. I'll say it this week before we start. Once upon a time, there was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, and he was walking in town in Barditchev, which is a small town in Ukraine, and he meets the town sinner. Every town needs a town sinner. Every town has a righteous person and the biggest sinner in town. And the biggest sinner in town sees Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak tells him, "Good morning." He says, "I'm really jealous of you," says the tzaddik, says the righteous person to the great sinner. And the great sinner, he may be a sinner, but he's in shock to hear that. The great Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is jealous of me. He says, "How are you jealous of me?" He says, "Because the Talmud says that if you sin and you repent, the sins become become merits, become mitzvot." Could you imagine how many mitzvot you would only have if you repent? So the point is that in Judaism, it's never too late. To the contrary, the negative action could actually be transformed to holiness, but that's beyond the scope of today. That was for last week. That was for chapter 7. The point here is everything is qualified. There's always a way to release ultimately, but we're talking, again, it's hard to do everything on one foot. You have to sort of read the entire, you have to read multiple chapters to get the full picture. So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so let's go to chapter 8. And we say, there's an additional aspect in the matter of forbidden foods, for which reason they are called isur, bound and attached, bound as in tied down, where the spark of God that's within them is hard to release. Even if one ate a forbidden food unwittingly, for the sake of heaven, i.e., in order to serve God with energy derived from it. Moreover, even if he actually carried out his intention, having studied and prayed with the energy derived from that food, the vitality contained in it does not ascend to become clothed in the words of Torah and prayer, as is the case with permitted foods, because it is held captive in the power of the Sitra Achra on the other side of the three unclean klipot, even if it is a rabbinic prohibition, for the words of the scribes are even more stringent than the words of the Torah. Okay, so that's the first point we mentioned. Now we're going to say as follows. Therefore, the Yetzer Hara, even impulse, and the force that lusts after forbidden things, is also one of the non-Jewish demons, which is the Yetzer Hara of the nations, whose souls are derived from the three unclean klipot. On the other hand, the evil impulse, that the craving force after permissible things, even when done solely to satisfy one's craving, is one of the Jewish demons. It is, as it were, a Jewish evil impulse. For it, the vitality of permitted things can be reverted to holiness, as was explained above. Okay, so what are we saying so far with the demons here? So everybody has demons. The question is, what are my demons? Naturally, what the Jewish soul, naturally that evil inclination, what the Jewish animal soul desires, it desires things that are not that are of the fourth klipa that has some light, in the sense that it wants things that are kosher. If one day I wake up and I lust for something that is non-kosher, that is not natural to the Jewish soul. It comes from an energy that is foreign to the Jewish animal soul. It's external. Internally, what does this Jewish soul want? The Jewish soul, the animal soul of the Jew, it also is self-oriented. It also wants pleasures, but what pleasures does it want? It doesn't want to rob a bank. It wants to engage in things that are permitted, but it wants to engage in things that are permitted for its own benefit, not for the sake of heaven. So in other words, he's differentiating between different types of desires, negative desires. One is natural to the Jewish natural soul, and one is unnatural to the Jewish natural soul. In any case, we continue, and we say as follows. Although the vitality of permitted foods eaten out of bodily desire can revert to holiness through the person's repentance. So we're switching now. We're talking about eating something kosher. I'm eating something kosher, but I'm eating it only for my own desire, not for any higher purpose. What did we say? Later we said, if I go and I serve God with that energy is elevated. So now we say, nevertheless, before it has reverted to holiness, it is sitra achra and klipa. And even afterward, after the person repented and elevated the energy of the food to holiness, a trace of it remains in the person's body, since each item of food and drink that one ingests immediately becomes blood and flesh of his flesh. And here's what I mentioned about the Kabbalistic idea of the punishment we're not going to call it a punishment, but the pain to cleanse the body and cleanse the soul before it returns to heaven. That is why the body must undergo a purgatory of the grave, a specific punishment for the body, in order to cleanse it and purify it for the uncleanliness which it had received from the enjoyment of mundane things and pleasures, which are from the impurity of the klipat noga and of the Jewish demons, i.e. the Yetzer Hara, which desires permitted matters, unless one has never derived enjoyment from this world at all in his life, as was the case with Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who said at the time of his demise that he had no enjoyment of this world, even to the extent of his small fingers. It's a fascinating personality. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Judah the Prince, was the author of the Mishnah. He was a great sage, and he lived in the second century, and he authored the Mishnah. He was also tremendously wealthy. He was close to the Roman emperor as well at the time, and he was so wealthy that they said, "How do you measure wealth in the ancient world?" Today, you go to Whole Foods, you get the same thing. But he says that the vegetables, basically all year, he had all type of vegetables, even the ones that are out of season, because he can pay to get them imported. So that was his wealth. So he was tremendously wealthy, and he lived in luxury. And he authored the Mishnah, or he created a collection of sages to come together in his hometown and author the Mishnah together, but he was the final editor. Before he died, he said, so he lived in tremendous luxury. But before he died, he said, I never had any pleasure in this world. What does it mean, never had any pleasure? I just finished telling you, he had every luxury at his table, even when it was out of season. The point is, the luxury was not a means, it wasn't a means, it wasn't a goal for itself. It was a means to an end. So whatever he did, all the pleasures he engaged in was with the awareness that this is to serve a higher purpose. So therefore, it never was unholy to begin with, as opposed to was differentiating that from somebody who does not have the awareness. I eat kosher food for my own pleasure, unless it's Shabbat. Shabbat, it's a mitzvah, even without the awareness. But I eat kosher food without a higher intention for my own pleasure. Nevertheless, it could be elevated. It could be elevated when I'll do a mitzvah after that with that energy. But temporarily, it's considered negativity, and therefore it has an effect on the person himself. Go ahead, doctor. But I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
So my question is, from the Chabad perspective, can a Gentile ever be considered holy?
Yes, the answer is yes. Let's go back to the beginning. When I said here in unholy, the pleasures of that are not Jewish, this is the exception to the rule. We discussed this back in chapter 1, that probably most Gentiles have the Jewish soul, have the animal soul that the Jew has. In other words, most Gentiles have good in their soul. They're categorized as the klipa of the holy klipa. So they're in the same category. Now, what if a Gentile engages in the world for a higher purpose, then it becomes holy. If a Gentile engages in the world for a destructive purpose, not only is it not holy, but he's actually making it worse. And that's what that's going to transition into the next point, because we saw in the 20th century how wisdom becomes so destructive. Medicine and physics all of a sudden is used to kill people by the millions. Okay, so what's happening here? So based on the model that we just said, of course, if you're engaging in wisdom, but you don't have a higher purpose of morality, then that study itself could be negative, and it could be it's negative. It's not could be. It's negative. It's unholy, and it could lead to negativity. But what happens if somebody a Gentile engages in the same study, but his purpose is for a higher purpose, to bring good to the world? Then that pursuit that could have been unholy, in other words, not transparent, you don't see the light of God within it, now it becomes a holy pursuit. So what we're saying here, with slight modifications, is universal. Now, he's speaking to the Jewish people. So for the Jewish soul, whose mission is a little bit more complex, there's going to be more conditions. What definition of holy, definition of unholy changes a little bit, because this whole discussion about not kosher foods does not apply to a Gentile, because that's not part of their spiritual mission. Right. But what we're going to say in the second half of the chapter about wisdom, that a wisdom, when you study wisdom, pursuit of wisdom also could be unholy or could be godly. And again, if it's not godly, it's unholy, right? If it's not transparent to a higher purpose, it's negative. That is universal. And like I said, we see it in that, we saw it in the 20th century, and we're going to continue to see it. That wisdom that does not serve a higher purpose is not holy. And if it's not holy, then by our definition is negative. And if it's negative, it could lead to evil.
Understood.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, what happens if a person does another sin? What's the sin? Idle chatter, wasting time, right? We're created for a purpose. If you're sitting and wasting time, that's a sin. Now, that could be, I'm sorry, idle chatter could be a sin, could not be a sin, because you have a constant obligation to study Torah. So if I don't study Torah, that's a sin. But if I don't know how to study Torah, so it's idle chatter, but it's permissible because I don't know how to study Torah. So right now I don't have an opportunity to study Torah, so I'm allowed to engage in idle chatter. But nevertheless, idle chatter is still not holy. And if it's not holy, it has effect on the soul. And now we're going to spend the next few paragraphs telling you that which punishment for the soul, but again, punishment is the cleansing, which cleansing for the soul is used for what matter. Now, we're not so concerned about this, but in the Kabbalistic writings, there's tremendous amount of literature about how to what's going to happen to the soul and what kind of cleansing, and therefore there are methods how a person could actually not wait for the soul to be purified after death, but you can actually purify yourself in lifetime. There are different methods like saying words of Torah. But so I don't want to get too much into this, but we're going to read it because that's what it says. For an innocent idle chatter, such as in the case of an ignoramus who cannot study, because if I could study, then it's a sin not to study. He must have his soul cleansed from this impurity of his klipa through its being rolled in the hollow of a sling, as is stated in the Zohar, Parshat Beshalach. But with regard to forbidden speech, such as scoffing and slander and the like, which is actually a sin, which being prohibited stem from the three completely unclean klipot, the hollow of a sling alone does not suffice to cleanse and remove the impurity of the soul, but the soul must descend into Gehenom, purgatory, which is a greater punishment and thus more effective in the cleansing of the soul. So too with one who is able to engage in the study of Torah, but occupies himself instead with idle chatter. The hollow of the sling alone cannot effectively scour and cleanse the soul, but it must receive the severe penalties which are meted out for neglecting for neglect of the Torah in particular, apart from the general retribution of the neglect of positive commandments through indolence, namely the purgatory of snow, as explained elsewhere. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Kudatayra, Shemais, these are all, see also Zohar. So these are Kabbalistic works that engage, that want to give you the path how to purify yourself in this world so you don't have to go through the purification in the next world. But essentially what we're saying is being consistent. When something is permitted, but it's not for a higher purpose, idle talk is nothing wrong. So that's one level of, that's not as bad. But something that is speech, which is prohibited, that's much worse and much harder to cleanse. So it's consistent with what we're saying up till now. Now we get to the idea of the wisdom, studying wisdom, pursuing wisdom. And like I said, it's a little interesting that it's fascinating. And he says, in some sense, if a person is going to engage in the acquisition of wisdom, which we think as the highest form of what makes a human being unique, but if it's not holy, not only is it not good, it's actually more destructive than idle chatter. Because idle chatter, what part of me does it corrupt? A part that's not that's a part that is not as great, but my mind is the greatest part of me. So I have to be extra careful not to corrupt it, not to use its wisdom in a way that doesn't serve a higher purpose. So this is fascinating. So let's see what we're going. Let's keep on the journey. Occupying with self with the intellectual disciplines of the nations of the world is likewise included in the category of engaging in inconsequential matters, insofar as the sin of neglecting the Torah is concerned. I'm studying science. It's idle talk. It's a waste of time compared to my obligation to study Torah, because I have to study Torah, as explained in the laws of Torah study. Later, we'll get to the exception. Moreover, the impurity of the intellectual disciplines of the nations is greater than the impurity of idle speech. For the latter, idle speech clothe and defile only the emotions which emanate from the holy element of ruach, ear within the divine soul. So emotions, idle talk gets me excited emotionally. Emotions are not as great as the intellect. So by tainting them with the impurity of klipat noga contained in the idle speech, which is derived from the evil element of ruach, ear, which is one of the components of the klipa in the animal soul, as mentioned above. Idle speech does not, however, defile the levels of Chabad, the intellectual faculties in the soul, for it is but words of foolishness and ignorance. So it does not defile the mind, since even fools and ignoramuses can speak that way. Not so in the case of the science of the nations. Thereby one clothes and defiles his divine soul's faculties of Chabad, intellect, with the impurity of the Klipat Noga contained in those sciences. The sciences have fallen through the shattering of the vessels out of the hinder part of Chachma, of holiness, as is known to the students of the Kabbalah. So we don't want to get into this too far, but the shattering of the vessels, basically, according to the Kabbalah, all wisdom comes from the wisdom of Torah, except that the wisdom of Torah, the holy wisdom, had experienced also the shattering of the vessels, and some of that wisdom fell, and that becomes the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of the sciences. Its source, its origin is in Torah, is in the holiness, but it fell down. Unless So let's read this the shaded box. Thus, the study of these sciences contaminates the intellectual faculties of the godly soul, and is therefore much worse than idle speech, which contaminates only the emotional faculties. Unless one employs them, these sciences, as a useful instrument, as a means of earning a more affluent livelihood with which to be able to serve God. So one way where the study of sciences will become holy is I want to study sciences so I could become more affluent. Becoming more affluent, isn't that self-oriented? No, I want to become more affluent so I could be able to serve God properly. That's one class. Another higher way, in other words, this is still indirect. I'm studying the sciences so I can earn a living, so I can have affluence, so I could serve God better. So I'm using the wisdom as a means to an end to be able to earn a living. But then there's a higher and deeper way, or unless he knows how to apply them, the sciences in the service of God, or to his better understanding of his Torah. For example, utilizes mathematics to better understand the laws of sanctification of the new moon. In other words, I can use, that's the second point. I want to understand sciences so I can better understand Torah. But before that, he says, I can apply the sciences to the service of God, before or to better understand his Torah. What does it mean to apply the sciences to the service of God? So that's what Maimonides mentions, that if the more I understand of God, the more I understand about the sciences of the world, the more I understand God's greatness and the more I will come to love God. And he concludes, this is the reason why Maimonides and Nachmanides, a blessed memory, and their peers engaged in them in the sciences, since they were able to utilize the knowledge in the service of God and Torah. So to summarize what we're saying here is that every part of the human being could be both remain human, and if it remains human, we're going to classify it in the language of the Kabbalah as the other side. It's human, but it's unholy. If it's human, it could become evil, but at this point, it's not godly. Or a person could use with the proper awareness, a person could engage in and elevate everything within this world, everything that is kosher, everything unless the Torah puts it off limits, and bring in the awareness, and doing so makes that act a godly act. And if it makes it a godly act, it's an act where the godly soul feels comfortable, right? Because remember, we have two souls, two orientations. And the animal soul, natural soul, is self-oriented, but the godly soul is in pain when the natural soul is taking over and just focusing on self. But if you're going to engage in the physical in a way that the physical has a higher purpose, and you're aware of that purpose, what that does is makes it a holy experience with where the godly soul says, I can also express myself here. And we're going to talk about it later. And that's why if you think about it, if the animal soul is in control, the godly soul is unhappy. But if the godly soul is in control, the animal soul could be happy if you train it to be happy, right? Because ultimately, you're not telling it not to take care of self. You're just introducing a higher dimension and a higher elements. The other way around doesn't work. The godly soul will never be happy when the person is just completely self-oriented. But that we'll talk about later when we talk about where the clash occurs, where the battlefield occurs between these two souls. And what is the battlefield? The battlefield is the three garments of thought, speech, and action. At every moment, both souls are fighting for space, for the intention, for the space, for the real estate of your thought, speech, and action. And that's the battlefield of life. Because unfortunately for one of the souls, we only have one mind, and therefore we only one of them could express itself through our thought, speech, and action at a time. And that's the essence of the battle.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So to me, the most challenging part of this is, maybe because it's me, is the idle chatter part. So that means if you're having a conversation about, how was your ride here? How is the traffic? Or yes, you ask somebody, how's your day? Or you tell some jokes.
Okay.
All those things, which is most of what unfortunately, that's how I spend most of my conversation, means that I'm really spending my time in the unholy.
Okay, so what is Rabbi Shneur Zalman telling you? He's telling you, let me ask you a question. First of all, you should be comforted. It's much better than studying sciences, according to Tanya chapter 8. But I'm kidding you.
but science is a little bit easier, because if you're learning about the solar system or you're learning about the human body, it's very easy to see God in that.
Okay, very good. You're on a high level. You're like Maimonides and Nachmanides. No, but that's serious. Let's go back for a second. Why, when you make small talk, why are you making small talk with somebody? Because you want to connect to them. That's transcendence. That's service of God. That's a mitzvah. Certainly if you're doing it with your children, even you're doing it to the person standing behind you in line in the grocery store, when people used to go to grocery stores before COVID. Why am I saying how's the weather? Because I want to connect to you. I want to make you feel good. I don't want you to be ignored. That's exactly the point here. If I'm only engaging in idle chatter for my own personal self-oriented pleasure, then it's a human activity. It's not an evil activity. It's a human activity. And if it's a human activity, then by the definition of the Tanya, it's expressing your natural soul, but it's not allowing you to express your godly soul, and your godly soul is uncomfortable. But if you're engaging in what he calls idle chatter, but like everything else, just like there's nothing here, there's nothing that's kosher. In other words, there's nothing that's not prohibited. When you read this, it's very heavy. It sounds like, oh, I have such a burden. Every second I have to have awareness. But if you look at it from the other perspective, it's actually radical in the sense that there is nothing that is not prohibited that cannot become godly. That you're getting from the Kabbalah, because you study the code of law. The code of law says if it's not a mitzvah and it's not a sin, then it's neutral. Okay, so most of my life I'm spending in the neutral domain. No, Rabbi Shneur Zalman is telling you that if you are going to engage in idle chatter, what he calls idle chatter. But if you're doing it for a purpose, for a higher purpose, not only is it neutral, but it becomes godly. So in that sense, it's actually elevating most of what we thought was neutral. And you say, just how I spend most of my day, it's not, thank you, sorry. Perfect, thank you. It's not neutral anymore. We just elevated from the realm of neutral to the realm of the godly. The same act, because the question is, what's the awareness? And what is the, in other words, in halacha, in Jewish law, you can come up with a theory, with a philosophical theory of the law. But to test it, just like in sciences, you have to test it. So if I come up with a theory, I have to test it. And the way you test it is, show me what they call, what's the nafkamina? What's the difference in reality between how does the idea affect in reality? Because it has to be tested in reality. So if I want to test if my idle chatter is self-oriented or it's godly, okay, so how do I test it? Do I engage in it when I'm not in the mood? I'm standing online and somebody tells me, good morning. I'm not in the mood. I'm not in the mood of talking to them. So I don't answer them. I ignore, or I don't smile, or I tell them something snappy, okay? Then that means that my idle chatter is just self-oriented. I only do it when I'm in the mood. But if someone needs a smile and I'm not interested, but I do it for them, that's the test. That's the test that when I do it all the time, I'm doing it for a higher purpose, right? But here again, just to reiterate, there is nothing by this model, by the model of Tanya chapter 7, Tanya chapter 8, sort of helps us define the theory, define the parameters of this method and its limitations and when it works and when it doesn't work. But going back to chapter 7 and 8 as a whole, there is nothing in this world, and this is a powerful statement, there's nothing in this world that is permitted, according to Jewish law, that cannot become holy. The other side, holy and godly, the other side of the coin of this worldview is a big responsibility, because if it doesn't become holy, it remains human. And if it remains human, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, human is a problem. Because everything has an inner spark. And you think that bagel, forget about me, you think that bagel doesn't want to be elevated? From the perspective of the Kabbalah, we have responsibility to the objects of the world that we interact with to release their energy and elevate them to holiness. So it's a big burden, but it's empowering, because not only everything could become neutral, but everything could become holy. The problem, and godly. The problem is everything has to become godly, because if it doesn't, I'm hurting not just myself, but I'm hurting also the object. From the perspective of the Kabbalah, this object here is waiting 6,000 years for a person to use it in a holy way, in a godly way.
Thank you.
Did that make it better? Or did that make it worse?
It makes it better, but it makes that there's never such a thing as idle, because then even
Right.
when you're talking to your child,
Yeah,
everything
idle would
has
mean
an
that
intention.
yeah, idle means that we call it idle in the sense that it doesn't have internal content. If you tell your child 2 + 2 is 4, it's not idle. It's something meaningful. When we say idle, we say there's nothing here. It's just small talk. There's nothing here. So that it's still idle, Chad. It's not Torah. It's not even sciences. Doesn't have an internal deep content. But like everything else, it is idle chat with the awareness for a higher purpose. And if it's for a higher purpose, it's elevated. And again, that could be applied to anything that is not tied down, which is where the Torah says it's off limits for the Jew. Anything that's not tied down becomes something that could become godly. And therefore, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, should become godly. And if it doesn't become godly, so there's two people that are hurt. First of all, my godly soul is trapped. My godly soul cannot express itself because it's pained. It wants to transcend. It always wants to transcend. So my godly soul cannot express itself. And if you want to talk about the objects in the world, the energy of the food, for example, or the energy of the car, and you'll see later the energy invested to build the car, et cetera, the ripple effect is profound, because we'll see later in the later chapters, when I use something and elevate it to holiness, I'm elevating not only it, but I'm elevating all the energy invested to get this thing to this point. And today we have a global economy, so there's anything you hold in your hand, literally, especially if you're holding a cell phone, the complex creation literally comes from every part of the world. Okay, so literally you are elevating energy. It has profound impact of the millions of people, maybe tens of thousands of people have to be involved in creating the technology and creating the supply chains and creating the systems that ultimately gets into your hands. And when you then go and make it godly, you're releasing all that energy and that entire supply chain. But that's for later. That's for the 30s. We're only chapter 8. That's chapter 37. So that's the global impact of what we do. But before we go global, we're still talking about the soul itself. Is my godly soul pained or happy when I'm sitting and chatting with somebody? Well, it depends. It depends. If it's human or it's godly. If it's human, it's unhappy. If it's godly, it's happy. What determines whether it's human or godly? Not the type of joke I say. It's the same conversation. It's not going to change my conversation. But what's my intention? Am I just chatting with you because it's fun for me? Right? I'm talking to you because it's fun for me. Or am I talking to you because I want to give to you? I want to transcend. I want to connect. I want my soul to connect to your soul. Oh, that's transcendence. Then I'm not just doing it for a self-oriented reason. And then it becomes godly. And if it becomes godly, it's a godly experience, and the godly soul feels, this is an action that can express my deepest desire, which is to transcend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now all I have to do is live up to this and we'll be fine. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I was struggling through the whole talk about the whole chapter. What is the criteria? And we partially understand it when it comes to day-to-day life, but when it comes to sciences, especially if it's not applied sciences, more like abstract, like philosophy, for example, even if I earn a living teaching philosophy, but it's a secular, or for example, ethics, but it's a secular ethics. Do you see any problem with that? And I'm hoping it's going to be explained later, but if not, could you please?
So first, the easiest one is to earn a living. Anything you do to earn a living, anything that's not off limits to according to Judaism, anything you do to earn a living is holy, because you're doing it to acquire, to be affluent, to be able to serve God in affluence. So that is okay. That's for sure. That's for sure could be elevated. What happens if I don't need the money? I won the lottery. So why am I studying philosophy? Because I enjoy it. Some people like cotton candy. Some people like classical music. Some people like philosophy. That is much harder. That is much harder. I don't need it for a living. I'm just doing it for simple pleasure. That's tricky. You have to know how to use it for the service of God. And that's what if you look at the words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, he says, this is the reason, Ela Kain, unless you know how to use it. And sometimes you have to figure out, how does this study of philosophy, how does this going to expand my understanding of making the world a better place? And maybe, and maybe I want to figure out how to make the world a better place. That's a higher purpose. But everything, the bottom line is everything has to have, if you want to move from the realm of the human to the realm of the godly, which is what your godly soul wants. Because remember, when I'm just expressing human thought, speech, and action, my godly soul's like, I'm trapped. I can't express myself. I'm being suppressed. The godly soul is being suppressed when it cannot express itself in a transcendent way. So what my point here is that anything I will do, any philosophy I will study, which is not godly, it's human wisdom. But if the human wisdom is being used for a transcendent purpose, maybe I'll learn how to be a better person. I'll learn how to perfect the world. I'll learn what mistakes not to make, at least not to make the world a worse place. Whatever the case is, you have to learn how to do it. But you're right, it's more complicated. And that's why Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, when earning a living is easy, any science that you're using to earn a living is wonderful. That's itself that itself is a redeeming factor and makes it holy. But even if you're not using it for the service of God, you're doing it for its own sake. Oh, there you have to know how to use it for the service of God. You have to know how to say, is this leading me to a higher purpose? Am I using this for a higher purpose? Because like I said in the beginning, if it's not godly, it's human. And if it's human, it could be negative. It could become negative. Not it is. It could become negative, right? Some of the greatest philosophers lived in Germany in the 1930s, right? I think there was I don't know enough about this, but Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva in YU, he came to the United States in the 30s, and he got a doctorate in philosophy in the University of Berlin, and he was a student of a great professor, which I forget the guy's name, and this person was a great philosopher, and Rabbi Soloveitchik studied under him, and this person became a Nazi, and he couldn't understand how it was terribly painful for Rabbi Soloveitchik to acknowledge that the human wisdom could become so corrupt so quickly. And the answer is, it has to be done with a higher purpose. It has to be done with the purpose of greater good and greater morality.
Yeah, so that's where it becomes tricky, because even if I need to earn a living, and I cannot teach something that contradicts ideas of Torah, right?
That's a different question. Teaching heresy.
Not here, but it doesn't overlap 100%. Science can become political.
If it doesn't overlap, it's okay. If it doesn't overlap, it's okay. If it doesn't overlap, it's okay. If it's heresy, that may be a problem. Then you have to speak to your rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And don't forget that every action we engage in, it's in our hands to keep it human or make it godly. So now we have our work cut out for ourselves.
Good
So
Shabbos, Rabbi.
a wonderful day.
Please tell my daughter all she had to say to you was Bubba Mises.
Then I would understand. Okay.
I don't know if she's still there.
I'm still here and I got to quit it now.
Anyway, have a good Shabbos.
If you want to tell your mother Bubba Mises, you should know that don't think it's just Bubba Mises, but it's actually a godly experience. That's the essence.
I'll maintain my intention.
Yes.
Have a great Shabbos.
Wonderful day, everybody. Thank you.
Angels.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.